The EFF leader Julius Malema paying his tribute and commemorating those who died on the Kopi at Marikana. He said again that Marikana is the spiritual home of the party, and that's why such a big part of their 10th anniversary celebrations have been held there today. Professor Sethulego Matebesi is the head of the sociology department at the University of the Free State. Professor, good afternoon to you. Marikana, of course, defined really still in our memories by that massacre. The EFF was formed about a year after the shootings. It was in Marikana where they had their first big public event. Also, though, I think the idea that Marikana is the spiritual home of the EFF could be contested. As our reporter Artie Mtungana pointed out just a moment ago to Malema, that ward is actually held by an ANC councillor. How do you see this?
Hi, good afternoon, Stephen, and good afternoon to the viewers. That's the nature of politics. I haven't seen a situation where political parties throughout the world would not want to exploit what I would say was actually a black spot in the history of South Africa, but yet for the EFF it represents a glorious opportunity to advance their ideology. And I also just want to pause and say ideology is associated with power structures. And the EFF as a political party is a power structure. And perhaps that's why they are advancing that narrative to say Marikana is the EFF birthplace. But I also want to question that, to say, but if Marikana did not happen in 2012, will the EFF not be formed? And those are some of the questions that some of us would want to ask. But they do occupy a very important space in the political landscape of South Africa, but it is definitely contested whether Marikana in itself is the birthplace of the spiritual birthplace of the EFF.
Is there perhaps a bigger message to what Malema is saying, perhaps, where, I mean, if you look at South Africa's history, it was defined to an extent by white people coming here, often for our minerals, and exploiting black people to do that, driving people underground in some cases, if we look at a hut tax, for example. And in a way, Marikana was the final expression of that. Yes, it happened in a democratic country. People were demanding just 12,500 rand a month, let's not forget, when the strike happened. Isn't Malema really saying, I'm talking up for miners who are exploited by mine owners who tend to be white?
Yes, if you look at the entire character, the nature of the EFF, and I've heard Malema also speaking about the DNA of the EFF, it is actually radical hostility. And Marikana represented, actually I would say it's closely aligned to what the EFF have been advancing, fighting for the disadvantaged, the most vulnerable in informal settlements. And Marikana then presented, as I've indicated, perhaps a very fertile ground for the EFF to perhaps demonstrate how even a democratic government is going against the will of its own people by killing mine workers. We should all know the struggles of mine workers in South Africa, where even up until today, we all know the struggles, the challenges that mine workers are facing, even communities who are living in this kind of community. So the EFF, is completely, different than mainstream politics. It's definitely exploiting situations like this, these societal challenges that people are putting to their own advantage. And quite interesting, for the past 2 months, another layer that the EFF brought to our political, landscape was this whole narrative of being an African organization which is respecting African culture and African rights. But some of us, there has been questions about, but whose rights are we referring to? And perhaps, as I've indicated in the past, it might be universal African rights, and that is very interesting. And it also perhaps indicates the route that the EFF would want to take during the next 10 years of their existence.
It's fascinating to see how this all plays out, because geography and politics sometimes matters, and sometimes doesn't. So the ANC is sometimes associated with the Eastern Cape because so many of its leaders in previous generations came from the Eastern Cape. But perhaps the culmination of the ANC's mass action during apartheid was the Freedom Charter, which was Soweto, was that area in Soweto which unfortunately has been neglected. Do you think that Marikana having a place, a geographic place in South Africa, does it matter to the EFF? I mean, I don't think the DA has a place necessarily at all.
No, not at all, but we will all associate the Democratic Alliance perhaps with the Western Cape, although perhaps they won't call it a spiritual home. But for the EFF, which I would say, although I don't condone and I don't agree with some of their modus operandi, at times using violence, being radical, where, logic has to dictate. But fact of the matter is they has been setting terms in terms of the route that our South African politics have taken. And I think what I'm trying today, context also matters. And you can't have context if you don't refer to space and also your geographic location. And I think there's also another reason why the EFF is doing that. If you look at the mining, the platinum mining belt around Rustenburg and all that, that is a fertile ground for you to launch your election campaign. And he has already mentioned, I mean, for me, almost like a blatant attack against the ruling party, the African National Congress, where every member wearing in public an ANC T-shirt now has to be called a murderer. That for me is very strong. But that is the narrative that the EFF have always been thrived on, to create and play on the emotions of South Africans or perhaps those who follow and who believe in what the EFF stands for. And I think you need to maintain that because they can't forever try to reinvent the wheel by just, demonstrating perhaps a radical attitude in Parliament. And these are the kind of things that builds up to that radical hostility of the EFF. And perhaps it will work for them, but for how long, that is the one question that we will have to ask.
Professor Sethulego Matebesi, thank you, Head of the Sociology Department at the University of the Free State. So many more conversations to come, I think, about the EFF as they continue their 10th anniversary.